It was mid-October when Lauren moved into her new home, an old, isolated cottage deep within the woods. The place had a rustic charm, with wooden beams that creaked underfoot and ivy-covered stone walls that told stories of time and weather. The trees surrounding the cottage were ancient, their gnarled branches weaving into twisted archways that loomed over the small house like silent guardians. Locals called the area the Hollow, a name that Lauren initially found quaint. They said it was a place where the fog always settled in autumn, rolling in every evening and lingering until the first frost of winter arrived. Most of her neighbors were distant, but the few who did speak to her warned her about the fog, their voices hushed and their expressions serious. They claimed it wasn't safe to be out in the woods after dark when the mist was thick. They spoke of disorientation, of people losing their way on familiar paths, of strange sounds that carried through the fog. Lauren dismissed their warnings, assuming they were superstitions passed down through generations, meant to keep kids out of the forest at night. For the first few weeks, she found the fog charming, lending an ethereal quality to the landscape. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch, a mug of tea warming her hands, watching as the mist crept in like a living thing, winding between the trees and swallowing the world beyond her yard. It felt like she had stepped into a fairy tale. But things began to change, gradually at first, and then all at once. It started with faint noises, soft murmurs she could hear just beyond her window at night. Sometimes they sounded like whispers, other times like distant laughter or a rustling that she couldn't quite place. She brushed it off as the creaking of the old house or the wind stirring the dry leaves. But each night, the sounds grew more distinct, more persistent, like a conversation taking place just out of reach. One evening, she swore she heard her name, a single whisper slipping through the cracks in the window frame. It sent a chill down her spine. Still, Lauren tried to rationalize it. She was new to the isolation of the woods after all. Her imagination was playing tricks on her, she told herself. But then, one particularly dense night, she stepped outside to gather firewood and saw something she couldn't explain. Through the thick mist, she noticed shadows shifting between the trees, people, or at least what looked like people, moving silently through the haze. Their outlines were blurred, barely visible, as if they were carved from the fog itself. Her heart raced as she tried to make out their features, but every time she focused, they seemed to dissolve back into the mist. Her breath quickened, a tight knot forming in her chest. She hurried back inside, locking the door behind her, but the unease lingered, pressing down on her like the weight of the fog outside. Determined to understand what was happening, Lauren spent the next few nights scouring the internet and the local library for information about the Hollow. She found a few old news articles and blog posts, piecing together stories of disappearances that had taken place over the decades. Hikers and wanderers had gone missing in the woods, their bodies never found. Some of the stories mentioned disoriented people who had been found wandering miles away from where they'd last been seen, mumbling about strangers in the fog or claiming they'd heard voices calling to them. She also discovered accounts from previous owners of the cottage, describing eerie occurrences, footsteps on the porch in the dead of night, voices that seemed to seep through the walls, the sense of being watched. Some of the accounts were over a century old, but the details felt unsettlingly familiar. The next night, as the fog thickened around her home, the noises outside grew louder, clearer. They no longer sounded like murmurs, but like the shuffling of feet on fallen leaves, the rustle of branches being brushed aside. At one point, she thought she heard a low, drawn-out sigh, like the exhale of someone standing just outside her door. Panic rising, Lauren decided she had to leave, to pack her bags and drive away before the unsettling presence could become more than just whispers. She hastily packed a bag, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the zipper. When she reached for the doorknob, she hesitated, feeling the cold seeping through the wood. The fog was so dense outside that she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. She held her breath and pushed open the door, but what she saw made her freeze. The shadows she had seen before seemed closer now, pressing against the windows, their shapes barely visible through the mist. She thought she heard a voice, just one, speaking clearly this time, a single word that sounded like her name. It was low and rough, like a whisper carried on the wind, and she felt the hair on her arms stand up. Terrified, she grabbed her phone and called the police, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, but even as she spoke, she could hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as if the fog itself was alive with murmured voices. By the time the officers arrived the following morning, the fog had lifted, revealing the forest in its damp, autumnal stillness. They found Lauren inside, pale and sleep-deprived, clutching her phone with red-rimmed eyes. She told them about the figures in the fog, the whispers, the stories she had read. The officers assured her that the fog could disorient people, that perhaps she had imagined the shapes due to stress or exhaustion, compounded by the isolation of her new home. But as they walked the perimeter of the property, they stumbled upon something that made them pause. Footprints circled the house, some overlapping, crisscrossing in the muddy ground, too many to belong to just one person. They led toward the trees, vanishing where the mist had been thickest the night before. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but when they turned back to Lauren, they masked their concern with forced smiles. After they left, Lauren stayed in the house for a few more days, unable to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She kept the lights on through the night, listening for any sound, any sign that the shadows might return. When she finally made the decision to leave, she sold the cottage for a fraction of its worth and moved to a small apartment in town, far from the hollow and its haunting fog. But every now and then, she would catch herself staring out her window at the distant tree line, wondering if the whispers were still out there, waiting for the next person to venture too deep into the mist. Every autumn, the town of Grayson transformed for the harvest feast, an annual celebration that had endured for as long as anyone could remember. Townsfolk gathered in the square, reveling in the bounty of the season, while the flames of a towering bonfire cast flickering shadows against the old brick buildings. Children played games, families shared stories, and local musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies. But beneath the warmth of the celebration lay an unspoken rule that everyone in Grayson seemed to follow. Never enter the woods after sunset during harvest season. Mark, a newcomer to Grayson, thought it was all just small-town superstition. He had moved there for a quieter life, far from the noise of the city. The townspeople were friendly enough, but when he mentioned his plans to explore the woods, they grew serious. His neighbors warned him about strange occurrences in the forest during the harvest season, stories of people getting lost, of hearing whispers in the night, and of unsettling encounters with unknown figures among the trees. But Mark laughed it off, believing it to be nothing more than folklore, old tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far from home. As the harvest feast approached, the warnings became more urgent. Mrs. Adler, who ran the local diner, told him about her grandfather, who had supposedly seen strange lights moving between the trees one autumn night. She lowered her voice as she leaned in closer, saying, "He was never the same after that night, you know. It's the forest. It does things to you if you're out there after dark." Mark politely nodded, but inside, he couldn't help but roll his eyes at what he saw as another small-town ghost story. Determined to prove that the stories were just old wives' tales, Mark made up his mind to camp in the woods on the night of the harvest feast. He told a few townsfolk about his plan, and their reactions were mixed. Some looked at him with pity, others with a quiet, knowing dread. A few even tried to change his mind, but Mark dismissed their concerns. "I'll be fine. It's just a night in the woods," he reassured them with a smile. The day of the harvest feast was lively and full of laughter, but as evening approached and the sun dipped low, a chill settled over the town. Mark left the festivities early, shouldering his backpack and hiking into the woods. The cheerful sounds of the town faded into the distance as he ventured deeper between the trees, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot the only sound accompanying him. By the time he found a suitable spot to set up his tent, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and a heavy mist began to roll through the trees. He set up his small campfire and settled down. the warmth from the flames comforting against the sudden drop in temperature. But as darkness fell, Mark couldn't shake a growing sense of unease, like the feeling of being watched from just beyond the reach of the firelight. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to his imagination, and focused on the warmth of the fire, the crackle of the burning wood. But then came the footsteps. At first, they were so faint he thought he might be imagining things, soft, almost rhythmic, like someone pacing slowly through the underbrush. Mark strained to listen, wondering if it was a deer or maybe another camper. But then he noticed the rhythm, slow, deliberate, like someone walking in circles around his campsite. He called out, hoping to catch a response, but the only answer was silence. The footsteps continued, growing louder, more insistent. Mark's heart quickened as a rancid smell filled the air, thick and suffocating, like decaying leaves and damp, rotting earth. He covered his nose with his sleeve, fighting the urge to gag. The fire flickered violently, struggling against the cold that seemed to press in from all sides. Mark grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the darkness between the trees. The beam cut through the mist, but revealed nothing, just endless shadows. But as he swept the flashlight back and forth, he caught a brief glimpse of something. Movement between the trees. It was gone in an instant, but he had seen enough to know it wasn't an animal. The shape was human, or at least human-like. Panic surged through him, and he quickly packed up his things, deciding to head back to town before the situation got any stranger. As he hurried through the forest, the feeling of being followed only grew stronger, a prickling on the back of his neck that made him quicken his pace. He stumbled over roots, the beam of his flashlight dancing wildly through the mist as branches clawed at his clothes. The footsteps seemed to follow him, always just a few yards behind, no matter how fast he moved. He broke into a clearing and froze. In the weak light of his flashlight, he saw a sight that made his blood run cold. An old, weathered picnic table stood in the center of the clearing, its surface covered in decaying food, rusted cutlery, and empty bottles. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, with moss creeping up the legs of the table and leaves piled around it. But the smell, sharp and sour like spoiled meat, was overpowering. It hit him in waves, making his head swim. Mark turned to leave, but out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half obscured by the mist. It was tall, gaunt, its posture unnatural. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see the figure's face, but he felt its eyes on him, watching. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the figure raised a hand, as if beckoning him closer. Terrified, Mark bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping against his face. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of town, panting and disoriented, just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. His clothes were caked in mud, his hands trembling as he tried to explain what had happened. The townspeople found him sitting outside the diner, pale and shaking, unable to put his fear into words. They took him to the local doctor, who suggested that the mist and cold might have disoriented him, causing him to panic and hallucinate. But when the sheriff and a few locals went to investigate the clearing he described, they found the old picnic table, just as he had said. Rotting food, rusted cutlery, and empty bottles scattered across its surface. The scene looked untouched for years, but the air around it still carried that pungent, rotting stench. There was no sign of anyone else, but the sheriff couldn't explain how the food could smell so fresh when the scene seemed so old. He didn't share this detail with Mark, but the look in his eyes when he returned to town was enough to convince Mark that something strange had happened in the woods that night. Mark left Grayson shortly after, moving to a larger town miles away, far from the shadowed trees and the foggy nights of the hollow. The townsfolk returned to their tradition of avoiding the woods after dark, but whispers of Mark's experience lingered. Some said he'd lost his mind. Others thought he'd been touched by something old and strange that lived in the forest. And as the next harvest feast approached, they spoke a little more quietly, keeping their eyes on the tree line and wondering if maybe, just maybe, the stories they'd heard all their lives were more than just superstition. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the night. If you enjoyed the hunt and want to see more adventures, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to stay updated on all our midnight mysteries, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell. Your support helps us uncover more secrets and bring you thrilling new content every week. Until next time, stay curious and keep hunting. This is The Midnight Hunt, signing off.